Welcome back to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How American Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Rachel. Today we're talking about some of the trades that we show at the museum, things that people would have done either because of necessity or as a profession, and just how we actually managed to interpret these past practices in modern times, how people learn how to do these activities, and what that means for the museum.
So one of our more interesting trades that we practice here at the museum would be the art of tinsmithing. So with us is Caitlin, who is in the process of learning about tinsmithing. So Caitlin, what exactly is a tinsmith?
Tinsmith is somebody who works with technically steel, but it has been historically hot dipped in tin to create that sheen because tin is too soft of a metal, and they are making all sorts of things like kitchen stuff and candle holders and like a whole mixture of things.
So how do you get materials historically?
That's a complicated question that I don't know the full answer to yet, but you would have metal workers who are making the steel who would then hot dip it, which is you have molten tin that you dip that steel into. Today we do more electroplating because it's cheaper, but it doesn't have the nice sheen to it, so we have the problem now of actually finding people who can hot dip the tin to work with.
So the tinsmith isn't necessarily doing that themselves. They are acquiring the materials from, say, essentially the tinsmithing version of a foundry.
As far as I know, yes.
Who is doing tinsmithing and how do you get started in it?
Typically, men would be doing the tinsmithing. Women are a part of it to a degree, but they would be painting using stencils and stuff, like onto pots and trays and stuff. But to get into it, you are starting as an apprentice, which is basically what I am. So you go to the tinsmith, they teach you how to do these things, and then either you're working in their shop for a while until you get really good at it, or you would start your own shop.
And what kinds of things are produced by a tinsmith?
A lot. Trays, bowls, cups, candle holders, chandeliers, needle cases. I just made a ring to go around my pincushion yesterday. They make a lot of things.
So tin is used in almost everything by the 19th century, right?
Yeah. Which, to an extent, includes roofs, but that is not pure tin. That is a tin-lead alloy that they dip the steel into instead. So that tinsmiths are also using, but that would be for your outdoor equipment and like wash tubs and stuff versus the pretty things that actually reflect light.
So tinsmithing can be very simple or very, very complex with what you're actually creating.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of geometry and planning that goes into making just a simple item.
Yes. So a lot of geometric algebra goes into it, and being able to use things like a marking compass and actually knowing how to use a square properly is really important.
Now, my question is, would a tinsmith know that he was doing algebra back, say, in the 1840s when he's making these items?
No, probably not. They're probably doing it more the way I do, because I can do the math, but I have a problem applying the math to the actual practice. So I can look at it, know what size I need it to be, and just kind of make it with the seam allowance allowed for it. Which ties into the sewing stuff too, because being able to just add that seam allowance is really helpful. And I started with something much more forgiving.
So we tend to see tin roofs in the south of the U.S. and much more common and remains more common today. Does that hold true with the tinsmiths of the 19th century, early 19th century? Or do you see tinsmiths mostly around the entire country?
In the 19th century?
Mm-hmm.
It's... Where you find tinsmiths is really kind of complicated, because to begin with, they are all in New England area, and the people you would actually come in contact with are peddlers who are selling you the tin. People who would put the roofs on are slightly different than the actual tinsmiths. Like, there's under the same umbrella as tinsmithing, but they are roofers. So that's completely separate. Versus those peddlers, once there is a big enough need for it, then you start seeing tin shops set up into towns, but they are kind of feeling out what needs actually made. Of, okay, does this area need all the stuff? So do we need a really big shop, or do we only need somebody who can make candle holders? Kind of thing. That way the peddlers didn't have to go all the way up into the New England area to go all the way back to Florida.
So tinsmithing is not centralized in the 19th century. There's also, you see a lot of tinsmithing even into the earlier periods of the colonies. But it seems that pewter is still taking precedence for, say, domestic ware in the 18th century. When does that kind of switch over?
I cannot remember the gentlemen's names. There are two gentlemen from Ireland who come over in the mid to late 1700s, and that's when they start to take root in New England area. From there, as they expand, that's when it starts. It takes them a while to get their business actually up and going here.
Is there any benefit to tin over pewter?
What they were putting in pewter originally could be really bad for you, but the same thing could technically go for tin because of the solders you're using historically have lead in them, so if you leave water in it too long, that's also not good for you. So tin is a little bit cheaper to use, and it's also easier to work with sometimes.
It also produces slightly lighter goods in general.
Yeah, much lighter weight. That's why the militaries really like using it.
So my next question is, when does tin go out of style?
It doesn't. We still use a lot of it today. Since I've started tinsmithing, I have a bad habit of looking at things going, that's not made very well, because it's all machine done instead of actually being made properly. The biggest difference is actual tin versus the stainless steel that we see a lot of now too. It's basically the same thing, just not tin.
So similar to the fact we still call cans for food tin cans, even though they're not made with tin anymore.
Yeah.
All right, just to finish off, what's the difference between a tinsmith and a tinker or a peddler?
There's a really big difference. So a tinsmith is actually working with tin and making those things, versus a tinker, they are fixing anything and everything with tin. So you would use a tin solder to fix a cast iron pot. If the lid or something broke, you are basically fixing it so that that cast iron pot can be used one more time, and then it's going to fall apart again. But they're fixing those, they're working on ceramics, they're doing everything instead of just tin. And then the peddlers would know how to do that tin work, they just haven't gotten to the level of true tinsmithing yet.
So why do you think there was such a bias against tinkers, so-called tinkers, since we use that sort of in a derogatory fashion?
Because a lot of them would end up charging you an arm and a leg for something that wouldn't actually last for a long time, and they would also claim a higher, capability of standard than they could actually produce.
All right, so, as you've been learning, what's the favorite thing you've made so far?
I've mainly only gotten to really make a cup, which was a lot of fun. But I'm also really excited to learn how to make a tinderbox. Just all of the pieces that get involved in that, and the math is going to be fun.
All right, so come on down this summer. Hopefully you'll get to find Caitlin in our tin shop. Thank you.
And now we're jumping to a discussion of woodworking, which doesn't seem like it might be a trade, but it was a very critical part of not only daily farm work, but also any sort of farming occupation, most things involve wood in the past, surprisingly. So we're going to actually talk to Alex. So, Alex, first question. Define woodworking.
Well, that is a very, very good question, because there are different parts of woodworking. So if you come to the museum and you see me interpreting, I do a lot of woodworking, and I do what's called green woodworking, where I'm working with green wood and I'm making hurdle fences, gates, palings, things that are needed on a farm. And that is a profession, and you're mostly working with coppice wood. At the same time that you could be working wood that way, you will have cabinet makers who are making furniture. You will also have housewrights who are making houses. So there are different types of woodworking. Some of the most skilled woodworkers are actually making ships. But at the museum, and what's probably more common and what more people are working with wood in the past, is working with green wood and making things for the farms.
The one specialized task that you did mention that's also extraordinarily significant is coffin making.
Oh, yes, you do have to make coffins. People do die in the past.
Coffin makers double as cabinet makers because you're making boxes. You may as well be able to shove things inside those boxes that aren't dead bodies. Especially, for example, clock cases. That's one of my favorite things to talk about on our 1920s farms, our clock case that could have been made by a local coffin maker. But what type of woodworking do we do at the museum? What kind of objects are we doing?
Well, what we are doing mostly is making items that would have been used on farms. So right now, I'm in the process of making 5-bar hurdle fences. And hurdle fences could be made out of 6 bars, or they could have been made out of wattles. And basically, a hurdle fence is a portable fence, and it's mostly for keeping sheep in or out of a place. And the English practice this farm practice called folding sheep. So just before you plow your fields, you enclose small areas, put your sheep in there, feed them things like turnips or turnip greens or other items, so you get a heavy dose of manure. And sheep's manure is considered the best manure for fertilizer. And then you move them to the next spot. They would also use sheep as grass mowers, because you can enclose small areas around your house and mow your grass. And this is something that I am working on. I am trying to make 30 hurdle fences. So next year, around the English farmhouse, every day for a little bit, we will have sheep eating the grass to see if we can keep the grass down without having to use any modern lawnmowers. The next thing that these green woodsmen are doing is making palings. And palings are like a picket, but they're split out with a froe. And since you're not wasting any wood by sawing, you get quite a bit from a small piece of wood. And that is helpful for making garden fences. Usually in England, the main field barrier is going to be a hedgerow, but a hedgerow doesn't work for a garden fence because any little critter can get on through and get to your garden. So you want it to be more substantial, like a brick fence or a stone, not a stone fence because little animals can get through stones, or a paling fence, which we have at our English garden. The other thing is you have to make a lot of farm gates, and this is where we tend to do. And the tools that we are using are mostly a froe, a twivel, which is a sideways chisel, a mortise and chisel, froe clubs, a beetle, and wedges, and a bow saw. And basically how they worked with in the past is they're using coppice wood, which is saplings that grow from the trunks of trees that have been cut, and you harvest them every 7 years. They get to be about 3 to 4, maybe 5 inches thick at the bottom and get narrow at the top, and they're straight grain, and you can usually split them very quickly, and you can make these fences very fast. And that's generally what you're going to see at the museum. Sometimes we are making specific things for the farms, like spoons, stirrers for making cheese, whatever you just can't buy at the store. What we wish we could do, and we did in the past, is have a cooper. That is another type of woodworker who is making barrels and buckets from wood staves.
So are the things that we make historically the most common things for a regular laborer to make?
I would say yes, because cabinetry maker, within a village, you might just have one good cabinet maker. You don't need a lot of people making high-end furniture, but you do need someone who is making a lot of fences.
So is this a career, or would this be daily work?
This is it is both. There are people, and they could just be called hurdle fence makers or green woodsmen, and it is a career, and they usually have access to coppice wood. And every 7 years, you might harvest an acre of coppice wood, which is going to make hundreds and hundreds of fences. So you don't need a lot of land. You tend to work where the coppice wood is. But on the other hand, a farmer, like the yeoman farmer we're showing, might be making hurdle fences himself off of trees on his property or saplings on his property, so you don't have to pay the hurdle maker. It's sort of like today. Is it cheaper to pay someone to do your work in your house, or is it easier for you to do the work? Those are the choices that people were making back in the past.
So you kind of mentioned a couple of the tools you need for woodworking. Could you kind of go into what those tools are and what they do?
Yeah, so the froe, which is the most important thing, it looks like an L, so it's got a wooden handle and it's got an iron part. It's like a little wedge that you pound into, say, a log or a piece of wood, and then you control how it's split by moving the handle back and forth. So that's how you're going to make thin rails or posts for the hurdle fences. Another one is a mortise and chisel, which is a good chisel that has a steel end, but it's got a wooden handle which you can pound on it to force the chisel into the piece of wood. We use axes, we use wedges, we use a beetle, which is a big sledgehammer, but it's made out of wood, because a lot of times if you hit iron with iron, it's just going to mushroom. But if you hit iron with wood, the wood will absorb the shock to the iron wedge and just drive it down. Those are the basic tools.
So where do you get the tools from? Where are they coming from?
Well, two places. One, you could go to your basic blacksmith, and they're going to be the ones making things like froes and wedges and also getting nails. But some of these tools are specialized tools and are made by specialized tool makers, and they tend to be more in urban areas. And then there are certain parts of Britain that are known for having better iron. So Sheffield is known for their steel. Birmingham is also known for their metalwork. And a lot of times these specialized tool makers are making hundreds and hundreds of the same thing, and then they're sold to merchants who then take them to the markets that take place all over England. So a lot of times if you're a farmer and you need to buy a chisel, you're probably going to buy that at a market, in a market town. In America, it's along the same lines, but at first, a lot of the good tools are coming from England until tool manufacturing takes place in this country. One of the hardest tools to make is a saw. So saw making is a specialized craft, again, based more in urban areas and more where they're known for. So Sheffield is a place where you can buy some good saws.
So is there a difference in regionality in any of these techniques with woodworking, or is it pretty much the same across the board?
Well, this is where I'm probably going to get myself into a lot of trouble, but I'm going to say it's very similar across the board, but certain people have different styles of tools, but they're doing the same thing. So you have different types of axes. You have different types of, a lot of times if you're trying to square off a beam, you would have a broad axe, which is flat on one side, and you do notches with a regular axe, and then you cut between the notches with a broad axe. There are various different styles of broad axes. So German's broad axes look different than British broad axes, which will eventually look different from American broad axes, but they're all doing exactly the same thing. It's also the same with brace and bits, which are the drills of the time period. They're how you make the little bits. The end of it can be very different from region to region, but they're all doing exactly the same type of work.
All right, so we have a lot of assumptions that visitors make from pop culture, from any sort of maybe historical fiction that they read. Can an average farm family build a farmhouse?
No, because let's take England, for example. It is a timber framed house. How you lay out the building is very important. The different joints that you do is very important. And farmers are a jack of all trades, but doing that type of work is just a step above what they're capable of doing. You need to be trained to do that, and usually in the past it's an apprentice system. So if you were going to be a housewright, you were probably going to be apprenticed at about the age of 12. And it's a long apprenticeship before you become a journeyman and start being able to build houses. It's the same with stone buildings. it seems easy to lay stone. It is not. It is something that is a skill set. You have to know how to cut the stone. You know, have to lay it out, have to know where to put the different joints. And on top of it, you have to know how to make mortar, which is not going to Lowe's and buying bags of mortar mix. It's actually slaking limestone to get the lime mortar mix to make it work.
So how does that apply to our 1760s settlement cabin?
Now, that is a very primitive house, and the average family could build that house. But if you looked at that house, I don't think anyone in their right mind would want to live in that house. And if you compare that house, which has got simple saddle notching, it's basic logs, there are no windows, the roof is very primitive, and compare it to the 1820s farmhouse, and part of the 1820s farmhouse was built in 1773, where you have it lined up very nicely. The rooms are very big. It's a very elaborate roof. And the knowledge to do that, again, is just beyond what a farmer could do.
So how did the earliest settlers to the valley know how to make these very primitive houses? Obviously, they hadn't been making them in Europe, so...
Generally, for log houses, and there is a thought that there's a very small Swedish colony just south of Philadelphia in Delaware, and that the Swedes built log buildings, and they are the ones who taught the English, the Irish, the Germans who came in and how to build log buildings. There is also areas in Germany, especially up in the mountains, where they also are building out of log, so that they have that tradition. But I also think it's a practicality thing that a lot of times the people who are moving into, say, the Shenandoah Valley, and they're some of the first people in, they have a skill set and a knowledge of what they need to do to get their farm up and running. And one of the things that they are hoping is once they establish their farm and more people move in, eventually the carpenters, the stonemasons are going to move in, the blacksmiths are going to move in, and then the next step for building a better house will become much more easier.
So it's probably a lot of word of mouth and just an understanding of, I need shelter, this is easy.
Right.
All right. Last question. Why do you think that the TikTok of you splitting a log is so popular?
I have no idea. I think part of it is there seems to be a trend on TikTok, which I tend to not really follow, so other people have showed me, of young men who think who are ripped or whatever, making a dramatic way of splitting logs, and here it comes an older person who does not look like he's in shape, and I managed to split a log and no problem whatsoever, using very primitive tools. And the key thing is most of those TikToks of people who are trying to be very dramatic, they're picking perfect wood where the grain is running straight, and good grief, anyone could split those logs.
So you don't have to be Chris Evans as Captain America to do that?
No, you do not. You just have to know how to read wood, and if you can read wood, you'll know what is split and what will not split.
So working smarter, not necessarily the harder.
Right.
All right, well, thank you, Alex.
All right, thanks.
So for something completely different, we have with us our costume coordinator, Sam McGinty, who has pretty much developed and designed the tailor shop in our German house. So, Sam, what exactly is a tailor?
So a tailor is, in general, someone who makes clothing. When we look at tailors in the period that we explore here at the Frontier Culture Museum, which is mostly 17th, 18th, and 19th century, a tailor is someone who primarily is making men's clothes, but also actually a good bit of women's clothing, at least in the 17th and 18th centuries. The sort of craft of tailoring really is an all-purpose manufacture where they're responsible both for patterning, cutting, and assembling garments. In general, a tailor denotes someone who went through the process of an apprenticeship where for a period of about 5 to 8 years they learned under a master most of those skills, which particularly in the patterning is the thing that requires a bit of time to understand and do proficiently.
So why is there a tailor shop in our German house?
So there are a few reasons. The first and kind of most practical reason for the museum itself is that we have a fairly constant need for clothing. That if everybody's working in the office, then no one's talking to the public. So that doesn't really work. So we set up a tailor shop really first and foremost on a practical level to have a place to sew and to produce clothing. For years here at the museum, interpreters would take work out with them and sit on whatever farm they're at, working in their laps, which can be a challenge for a number of reasons. But one of the more important ones is just not having all the tools you might need to succeed. So there was a very practical aspect to building the tailor shop in Germany. As far as the sort of historical context, it is pretty appropriate for our German farm. Our German farm is a peasant's farm from the Palatinate, so southwestern Germany, an area that in the 18th century for a peasant was probably really not all that great. And many of the peasants that we know really were having to take up second jobs or second trades at that point in time, really just to make ends meet, but potentially if they're thinking about leaving Germany, which could be a pretty expensive proposition, that additional income was necessary. So we know that sewing and tailoring was one of a number of potential sort of trades there, so to speak. For us here, tying more into the museum narrative broadly, the benefit that we have is that we know that George Bowen, who was basically the patriarch of the family who built our 1820s house, we know that he was a tailor or a Schneider in Germany before he made the decision to move the family first to Pennsylvania and then to Virginia. So it sort of ties it all nicely for us. The space in the German house is what's referred to as an Anbau or an add-on room or an annex, and it is the space, contextually speaking, where German peasants, if they had the space, would be using it to make additional income. So it all sort of ties together pretty nicely.
So why is tailoring not considered a luxury good in the 18th century like it is today?
Yeah, so the big key factor when it comes to tailoring, and really when it comes to just about all finished goods in the 18th century, is that labor in the past was not valued equitably and significantly less equitably than it's valued today, in that when you look at the cost of a tailored good, the vast majority of the cost for any garment really was the material cost, not the labor component. So, for a middle to lower class garment, probably somewhere between 60 and 80% of the cost of the garment was in the material. For sort of upper middle class to upper class garments, it's probably closer to 90 to 95% of the cost of a garment is in the material, meaning everybody, relatively speaking, had access to tailors just depending upon what cloth they could actually afford to have them work with. So really everyone in the 18th century went to tailors, or for some women's clothing, dressmakers, to have clothing made for them rather than trying to make clothing themselves and potentially messing up the material that they'd spent a good bit of money on. The other thing is it's just an issue of skill set, right? In that today we are very eager and accepting of the notion of DIYing stuff, and a lot of that has to do with the information that's available at our fingertips. If you don't know how to make clothing, and most people didn't, you just accept it as a necessary expense of your day-to-day life, in that you need clothing and you don't know how to make it. Same way most of us don't know how to potentially repair a car and go to a mechanic. Same kind of thing.
So is there a difference between historic methods of garment construction and today? Isn't basically all sewing the same?
So there are pretty significant differences. It's really not all the same. A lot of the sewing today, or ideas on sewing, order of operations, method of construction, mostly have to do with more modern thoughts that you might have learned in home ec class, and a lot of that revolves around the sewing machine, which kind of changed the ballgame. When we look at sewing throughout really almost all the context that we have here at the Frontier Culture Museum, we're looking at a context that is before the advent of the sewing machine as a sort of common item. And really, when we're looking at the 17th and 18th century, they're basically we're not sewing machines in any form or fashion. So their method of sewing was different as a result of that. When we look at the method of construction in the 18th century, really it's all by hand, but it is also very compartmentalized and pieced in that a modern notion of sewing with a sewing machine, for example, if you're making a coat, you would assemble all the fashion fabric or the facing or externally showing pieces. You would then separately assemble all of the lining material, and then you would pin them together inside out, basically sew them all together, and then turn them the right way and close them up in what's called bag lining, which is something you really don't see in the 18th century. All 18th century stuff, for the most part, the lining was put in by hand in a way that is more challenging and more time consuming, but you could argue really has a better result. So it very much is a thing that, 18th century clothing, part of the reason perhaps that it looks so funky is that the methods that were used to put it together to our modern notion are kind of funky.
So how do you learn how to make garments in a period style?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Simplest answer is you ask somebody who knows how to do it. The benefit that we have today in 2022, more so than almost any other time in human history, is we have access to a much higher amount and volume of information than anyone else. Even if you look, 50 years ago during the bicentennial, the clothing you would see potentially at a museum or at a reenactment today is significantly better as a result of that information. What many people have done over time is, particularly those at larger institutions with larger collections, is they've taken the time to look at the actual nitty-gritty of how garments were assembled and then used a bit of experimental archaeology to reproduce that. So for some, if you go and work at Colonial Williamsburg, Mark Hutter, who's the master tailor, and the journeyman in his shop are very well educated on exactly how you put a garment together, and will teach you if you apply for an apprenticeship there at Colonial Williamsburg. For the rest of us that might not be quite so fortunate, it very much is a case of asking questions. It's also quite a case of looking at original and extant garments as much as you can, and then it just comes down to practice. Once you roughly understand the concepts of how garments are assembled, you then can often extrapolate that sort of once you're looking through that lens to how to assemble other things that you might not get the chance to have looked at.
So you mentioned earlier that you might go to a dressmaker for certain items of female clothing. Is there a difference between the construction of male and female garments?
It depends upon the garment. The difference between a tailor and a dressmaker is really in difference of approach to how a garment is made. When we look at men's clothing in the 18th century, breeches, trousers, waistcoats, coats, greatcoats, so on and so forth, all of that clothing is made in panels. So there are front panels, back panels, sleeve panels, undersleeve panels, collars, so on and so forth, that all are, depending upon the decade and depending upon what's in fashion, relatively similar silhouettes. The skill of a tailor is in taking those shapes, and typically shops would have shapes for each of those pieces that are of the silhouette and style that the shop is presenting. And once a tailor took a man's measure, they would then scale those standard shapes to the dimensions of the individual. So it's really all in panels. Pretty much all men's clothing in the 18th century is just a game of scaling panels. That is applicable for some women's garments too. If you look at some women's jackets, if you look at stays, which are the foundational garment for women, and a few other things here and there, some of those are also paneled garments. So you do see tailors or some sort of specialized tailors like a stays maker making a degree of women's clothing as well. You also do see certain women who are choosing to dress in clothing that is more evocative of men's style. You see it in imagery, quite a bit of, particularly military imagery, when you're showing women of officers' wives dressing in riding habits, which are evocative of military style. So that's the same thing where you probably are seeing a garment that was made by a tailor. By contrast, and there are panels in some of them, but when you look at gowns and other women's dresses, those are typically made by dressmakers who have a different approach, where tailors are taking standardized panels and scaling them to shape. A dressmaker typically is taking fabric and draping on a form, so working more in a three-dimensional approach. And that process of draping fabric, pinning fabric, and assembling garments in that way is just an entirely different approach to clothing. So those are the sort of two dichotomies of clothing in the 18th century. The one which is very flat on a table and using some unit of measure to scale shape, versus the more sort of hands-on, three-dimensional shape and pinning things on. So that's sort of where the clothing divide in the 18th century lays, is whether or not you're draping or you're tailoring and scaling.
So back to our German shop, how would a village tailor know the changing styles and be able to reproduce them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the most practical answer is that a small tailor like this is probably not operating as an independent entity. So when we look at residential Germany in the 18th century and rural Germany in the 18th century, a tailor like this, in the context that we're showing in a small rural village, probably is not just working for himself. You probably would have seen that kind of tailor working in what was referred to as the putting out system, which is a system where they would be contracting to a merchant or a tailor in a larger market who would be dropping off basically pre-cut and pre-drafted projects, where this smaller tailor is basically functioning pretty close to a sweatshop, where they're just doing all the assembly and then leaving it outside a certain day of the week for that same merchant to pick it up. So by looking at that putting out system, the tailor then would have access to the shapes and styles of garments that are in larger markets in cities that probably are a little bit more evocative of fashion. Beyond that, fashion's a pretty basic thing, in that, in the same way that we all got a new pair of tennis shoes when we were in school and immediately walked around school in them and wanted everybody to see them, people in the 18th century kind of did the same thing, in that, if someone had, and if you look at an American context, say the newest fashion from France or the newest fashion from London, they didn't just leave that in their closet and only wear it around the house. They wore it out and about, which would, if you saw someone else wearing a cool new piece of clothing, probably meant you went down to your local tailor and had something made for you. You do see fashion plates being a thing, particularly into the 19th century, that are showing the latest fashions. And, there are also those that will use military fashion to inform civilian clothing. Dudes like Washington is wearing a good bit of military-esque garb. Even when he goes to the Continental Congress, basically shows up in a militaristic uniform. So you see that as well. So fashion is getting influenced by a lot of different sort of things, and different people might be influenced from a number of different sources.
Here's one that you probably hear a lot down in the shop. Where does the fabric come from?
Yeah, this is probably my favorite question, in that there's not just one answer. Fabric came from everywhere. And fabric is probably the best example we can show here at the Frontier Culture Museum of how truly global the economy of the 18th century was. In that you could be getting fabric from 5 miles away or 5,000 miles away. It really just depended upon the fabric in question. When we look at wool, and really wool was the probably most highly used textile, particularly for the classes that we show during the 18th century. Wool is being produced in a few different places. Really, the best wool is being produced in England in the 18th century and being exported all over the place. Ireland is also producing wool in the 18th century. The difficulty is they're being embargoed from exporting it. You also see France producing a good bit of wool. Difficulty often with French wool is it was regarded as being of lower quality. So one of the nicer things about wool is that it's durable, or at least it's meant to be durable. So if you think about, say, British soldiers who were coming to America in the 18th century, they're all wearing wool coats. It's not necessarily to keep them warm. It's more that the British Army wants to issue one uniform a year and have it last an entire calendar year, and wool was the only textile good enough to do that, particularly English wool. The difficulty, as it seems, with French wool is it isn't quite as good. So where English wool will hold a raw edge, meaning you can cut it and leave it and it won't fray, French wool seem to not have that same property, and that's part of why English wool seem to be pretty highly revered. Second to wool really is linen. Linen is the other very common textile of the 18th century. Linen is another one that's produced here, there, and everywhere, and goes by different names, whether it's being called Osnaburg, linen, sort of different names here and there. The linen we kind of explore and focus most here at the museum is Irish linen, which, because they couldn't export wool, is one of the main exports for Ireland in the 18th century. But you also do see linen being produced kind of just about everywhere, and will have different sort of properties or different factors depending upon where it's made. Linen might be made from flax, might also be made from hemp. Both of those are popular in the 18th century. The benefit to linen as a textile is that linen is far more washable and durable to washing than wool is. So for your base layers, shirts, shifts, the things that you're laundering frequently, linen is kind of the logical textile for that. You also do see being used as sort of very cheap labor clothing, or at times very cheap and sort of temporary summer clothing in very hot climates. The other sort of textiles that we look at are the more exotic or luxury textiles. So like cotton. Cotton is something that, at least in the 18th century, which is where we have the shop set, has not really taken off as a common textile. It's not the big textile that it will be for England in the 19th century. It's not a textile, or at least a raw material, that's being produced a lot in North America in the 18th century. Most of the cotton that we're looking at in the 18th century is cotton that's being imported from the East. So being imported from India and from China in the 18th century. What's referred to as Indian chintz, or Indian printed cotton, is very, very popular in the 18th century in that it's being imported into Western market, has bright, vibrant colors, and is really darn cheap, which for your peasants and your lower class is pretty desirable. You also see nankeen, which is being produced in China and exported. It's very much a cool kids fabric in the 18th century. You know, like Washington and a number of sort of cool dudes, so to speak, have suits made out of nankeen in the 18th century. The benefit to it is that it is more durable and harder wearing than linen, but still has a degree of lightness and airability that wool does not. So you see that kind of luxury fabric being imported, and it's popular enough that it's actually being knocked off pretty typically in England and being sort of faux nankeen is being sold. You also do have silks that are being imported from the East, not something that we typically show a whole lot of here at the Frontier Culture Museum, in that it's just not representative of the class of some of the farms that we sort of show. Though there is, a good bit of documentation, at least when we're looking at the American farms, that there are farmers with very few possessions being listed in the Valley of Virginia in the 18th century, but silk gowns or silk coats, in that they have gotten money for the first time and they're going to spend it on stuff they probably shouldn't. Beyond that, there are velvets and things like that, and velvet can be made out of a few different materials that are available. A lot of the velvet that you would have seen in this market would have been produced in England as well. When we look at British North America or colonial North America in the 18th century, you do also see cloth being produced, particularly in the 1760s and 70s leading up to the Revolutionary War. That's often referred to as homespun fabric, not necessarily indicative of it being produced in someone's house, more so indicative of it being produced independent of England, which is a thing as well. So fabric can kind of come from anywhere.
When does the mass production of clothing take over from bespoke tailoring?
It's a tough one to answer. The idea of bespoke clothing remains even into the 20th century. So it actually kind of staves off the sewing machine, at least at first. But the big arbiter for change really is the sewing machine. And really the Industrial Revolution broadly. There are a few factors that sort of go into that. The first factor, and a pretty significant factor, is that with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of things get cheaper. So many produced goods, you think about things like shoes, textiles, a factory owner, and there were factories in the 18th century, they're just not mechanized factories, but a factory owner, rather than paying a journeyman or someone who's gone through an apprenticeship to learn a trade, and paying them a higher wage because they're a journeyman, if they can pull someone off the street to work a mechanized machine, like a mechanized loom, and do it much cheaper, that reduces the cost of the fabric or whatever other finished good. So as the 18th century goes into the 19th century, and as the 19th century goes on, the cost of certain items like fabric starts to go down, which part of the reason that tailoring was so important as an industry is that because the cloth was so expensive relative to labor, you kind of had to go to a tailor. But as the cost of fabric, relatively speaking, is reduced, the notion of doing things yourself or doing things in the home kind of comes about a little bit as well. But the big thing is the sewing machine, where the sewing machine and the idea of mass producing clothing starts to become kind of a thing throughout the middle of the 19th century. Part of that is having to do with fashion, in that the really well tailored, tightly fitting clothing of the 18th century sort of falls away. But a lot of that is influenced by the fact that the sewing machine just makes it a lot quicker and a lot easier. You do see in certain rungs of society all the way through the 20th century the notion of bespoke tailoring sort of continuing to be a thing. But at some point in the 20th century, ready-made clothing or mass-produced clothing really takes over, and then bespoke clothing or custom clothing really starts to be relegated to something that's only approached by a certain class. The difficulty today, it's not a difficulty, it's actually a good thing, but the difficulty today is that because we now legally value labor in a different way, bespoke clothing is relegated to something that not everyone can afford. You can still go to Savile Row in England, which has been known for a long time as sort of the fashion hub at one point of the world, but at least now of suits and that kind of clothing, and have a bespoke suit made by one of the fashion houses there. The difficulty is after the cost of the material, which can be pretty high, and then the cost of labor, you're looking at least a $5,000 to $10,000 suit when it comes to all the hands that are touching it all the time going into it. So now bespoke clothing is very much restrictive to class. The only potential way to go around it is if you go to somewhere where they don't value labor equitably. So if you go to Vietnam, Hong Kong, China, there are quote-unquote bespoke tailors there who will still offer you a suit, say, under $1,000. That being said, you kind of have to think about the labor practice, right? That, the notion of a suit being expensive because the people that are making it are getting paid equitably perhaps is not necessarily a bad thing. So the notion of, having purely bespoke wardrobes the way that people did in the 18th century, probably will never be a thing again. But that's probably okay.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks.
So we hope you enjoyed Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We bring you historical episodes twice a month. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.